Neil Marshall's directorial debut, Dog Soldiers, was part of a batch of horror movies released after the Blair Witch Project had breathed new life into the horror genre, which throughout the 90s had declined in both output and quality, certainly when compared to the volume and impact of the films produced in the 1970s and 80s. The British horror film had fallen into decline even earlier than the barren 1990s. Johnny Walker states that the 1980s had seen the production of only a handful of British horror films, which at any rate were mostly thought of as American productions that had peripheral British involvement. And alongside Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, Marshall's film hinted at an exciting rejuvenation of genre films produced within Britain. Both films were bold and adrenalized additions to the genre and wore their Britishness boldly on their sleeves. Given that Marshall's film centered upon a group of infantry soldiers pitting their wits against a family of werewolves, it's perhaps understandable that the film was male-centric and oozing machismo. Marshall's sophomore offering, The Descent, utilizes elements of the first film, such as a group of humans increasingly divided and diminished as they're besieged by a group of non-human foes. But this time his protagonists are exclusively female, which to an extent addresses the lack of female representation within Dog Soldiers. The narrative concerns a group of friends who enjoy pursuing group activities that fall into the category of dangerous sports. The group are introduced whitewater rafting, whilst the husband and daughter of main protagonist Sarah watch from the safety of dry land. From the offset, these women are clearly very different to the traditionally passive female protagonists within horror cinema. And indeed, the active, resilient female protagonist is certainly more prevalent in the films produced within this period, where earlier periods had often reduced women to the role of demure scream queens. It's significant that the women participate in this activity and others without the guidance of a male expert. Their elected leader, Juno, is one of their own. This group of women are assertive, active, and more than capable of operating as a unit without the expert input of a male overseer. Indeed, the apparent bond between the women is so strong that it's almost jarring to see Sarah's husband and daughter watching the activity, as though this slice of domesticity is out of place and intrusive. Whilst it's clearly important for Sarah's daughter to view her mother as a woman with profound agency, her presence at the river represents a crossing of a line that demarcates both the spaces of home and adventure and the roles of mother and adventurer. This is certainly not to suggest that a mother cannot be an adventurer. Rather, the problem within the film is the bleeding of the roles into one another, eliciting feelings of guilt and neglect, and the bleeding of one space into the other. Having Sarah's family unit present at the site of a group activity almost pulls Sarah away from the group dynamic. Through exposition that manages to be natural rather than an information dump, we learn that most of the women are professionals, doctors in training, teachers, and so on, and it's perhaps the presence of their ambition and energy that drives them towards thrill-seeking leisure activities rather than any apparent sense of safety and dissatisfaction that their professional lives elicit. The activities the group performs are a means of momentarily discarding their professional responsibilities and engaging in some visceral thrills. The question then is, which of Sarah's spheres of experience, family or professional, does she wish to momentarily escape from? Whilst the bond between the women does appear to be strong, it's primarily centered upon their shared love of adventure sports. There are signs of fissures in both their relationships with each other and with those outside of the group, especially in the case of Sarah, her husband Paul, and her friend Juno. As the women relax in a cabin on the eve of their cave adventure, they indulge in seemingly playful banter that may hint at divisions within the group. Beth is teased about her age, being somewhat older than the others, whilst most of the women seem to distrust Juno to some degree. Part of this trepidation towards their nominal leader is due to Juno's steely focus, and partly because she brings along her protege, Holly, who is essentially an outsider. Indeed, Juno and Holly represent one of three pairs of relationships within the group, with the others being sisters Rebecca and Sam, and close friends Sarah and Beth. There is a suggestion that the group have convened at various points in time, with Sarah and Juno having apparently shared a long friendship that doesn't seem to be as close as it might once have been. Despite their collective interest in exploring the cave system, amongst other pursuits, there is a tangible sense of disconnection within the group. The most profound breach within this group dynamic is due to Juno's clandestine relationship with Sarah's husband. After watching the women whitewater rafting, Paul drives Sarah and their daughter home, but seems distant and distracted, resulting in him straying into the path of an oncoming van, which causes the death of him and his daughter. Sarah's recovery, both physical and psychological, becomes a focus for the group of women and the reason for their foray into the cave system. While Sarah is unaware of Paul and Juno's indiscretion until much later in the narrative, there is an unspoken tension between the pair, clearly because Juno carries the burden of guilt with her. In fact, the relationship between the two women bears the tension of unspoken dynamics. Juno repeatedly hints at Sarah's capabilities as a climber, and yet seems entirely comfortable with her own position as leader. It's perhaps this sense of competition that allowed Juno to entertain the idea of an affair with Sarah's husband, Sarah having the marriage and family that Juno does not. Similarly, whilst Juno tells Sarah that she thought they could name the apparently undiscovered cave system after her, a gesture presumably designed to boost her morale, Sarah and the other women recognise that it's the act of leading the expedition that carries any real sense of kudos. It's Sarah's commitment to her family that pulls her attention away from the group. At one point, it suggested that Sarah used to be a great climber. Has her family life diminished this participation? Whilst Paul's feelings for Juno pull him away from the family unit. Once inside the caves, the group work their way into the system's depth with relative ease until a narrow tunnel they're utilising collapses. At this point, believing they're trapped, they become agitated, and as they look for a way out of the cave system, the group discovers some cave paintings which reveal to them the fact that the system has two entrance and exit points. Their focus from therein is therefore to locate this secondary exit. These cave paintings depict scenes of early humans hunting large animals, actions that were necessary for their survival, yet carried the potential for great injury and death to the hunters. The parallels between the two groups, the group represented by the cave art and those finding themselves trapped within the caves, are clear. Both undertake high-risk activities that fulfill quite different needs. Clearly, the people responsible for the cave etchings risked their lives to ensure they had the food and furs that prevented their starvation and exposure to the elements. The women undertake their own high-risk activities for apparently less immediately pressing reasons. Certainly, their physical survival doesn't benefit from their descending beneath the earth to crawl through tight fissures. However, there's a profound group need to temporarily experience danger, albeit in a controlled and monitored environment. The ensuing ordeal that the women face has none of the premeditated control that marks their usual activities, and instead offers them an entirely authentic confrontation with danger. Juno uses a lighter flame to discern the presence of the breeze, indicating a path that leads to an exit. It's here that the group's effective exit from the cave requires a unified working relationship. Instead, Holly, Juno's impetuous protege, selfishly rushes along the path, wanting to be the first to find a way out, before sliding down a chasm and snapping her leg in the process. There are two betrayals of trust that lead to this unfortunate situation. Firstly, Juno deliberately allowed the group to believe they would be exploring Boredom Caves, described as Boredom Caves by Holly. The women prepared for this cave system by familiarising themselves with the layout described in the guidebook, and they were under the impression that Juno would have informed the local authorities of their expedition as a precautionary measure so that any rescue team would know where to look for them should problems arise and they didn't return home. In deceiving them, Juno has ensured that they don't have enough information to navigate the caves. Secondly, Juno has invited Holly along, and it's likely that she's well aware of Holly's impatience. Juno's desire to make the group's adventure more exploratory and her wish to bring along her protege not only result in Holly's accident, but the deaths of her and everyone else in the group apart from Sarah. Whilst Juno's egotistical decisions have condemned the group to certain death, their inability to work collectively is a deciding factor in their plight. Sarah finds it especially difficult to focus on teamwork and succumbs to both hysteria and paranoid delusions. While she does indeed notice one of the crawlers before the group do, she does hear a child's laughter at several points during the narrative. The claustrophobia, coupled with the anxiety inherent to the situation, induces a return to a loss-based trauma for Sarah that prevents her from effectively contributing to the group's efforts until later in the film, after she's had an intense encounter with the crawlers and entered into a form of violent fugue. Indeed, it's been suggested that the encounters with the crawlers and the crawlers themselves are part of a psychosis Sarah suffers during the adventure, and that it's actually Sarah who kills her friends. Whether this is indeed the case, it is at the very least probable that Sarah is experiencing a severe psychological episode during her time underground. James Marriott has argued that Sarah suffers from survivor guilt, citing a nightmare she has on the eve of their descent, in which a pole impales her face as evidence. He further states that her dangerous actions within the cave, urging Juno to throw away her flare and inadvertently leading the group into an attack, evidence perhaps a death drive. Certainly her extreme agitation and her repeated auditory hallucinations suggest that she's far from processing the deaths of her husband and daughter. The decision to subject Sarah to the caving expedition, given her temperamental psychological state and the duplicitous nature of the information the group are working on, adds further weight to the litany of mistakes made by Juno.